So what is it for you that got you to say, okay, I have this desire, but I'm actually going to follow through with it. I'm going to go do the humanitarian aid and I'm going to go take on these things.
Yeah. So when I went to college, I had never been outside of the country before. Canada, no Mexico, nothing. As a kid, like I think made it to Hannibal, Missouri once, and also went to Cleveland where my aunt lived, right? So not a lot of foreign adventure, but when I was a freshman in college, they had a program where if you had never been abroad, you could apply for a grant to go overseas to study. Now, this is actually, it's a very long story, so I'll give you the 20-second version. We can turn it into a longer one if you're interested. But I ended up going to China in 1993. Now, when people think about China today, they think of the kind of growing, booming economy. I went to China in 1993. This was just a couple years after Tiananmen Square. It was a time when people were still riding bicycles all over Beijing. And the short version of a long story is that I ended up getting arrested in China for teaching about the Constitution. Now, that was a huge wake-up call for a kid from Missouri, but I came home from that and was certainly interested in exploring more of the world. And after my sophomore year, I had a professor who was going to work with refugee children who were survivors of the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. And specifically, these were unaccompanied children. So unaccompanied is a word that's used in the international community to talk about kids who were orphaned or who might have been separated from their parents during the war and were living alone. So I went to work with Bosnian refugees, and I ended up as a 20-year-old kid living and working in 2 different refugee camps with unaccompanied kids and some of the other caretakers who were there. And talk about hardship, right? That was a real lesson and insight into what real tragedy looks like. I mean, you're talking about families where almost every single person in the refugee camp had obviously lost their homes. Many of them had lost family members. They'd seen husbands, brothers, sisters, wives, cousins, children murdered. They're living in a refugee camp and they have no idea when this situation is ever going to change. And many of them have been stuck there for years. And one of the lessons, Kenny, that I actually saw in the refugee camps, which was really interesting, was that I saw that a lot of times the people who I thought were struggling the most were the young people who were about my age. They were kind of older teenagers, young adults, because their whole life had been cut short. And they're here in this refugee camp. There's all of this tremendous tragedy, and there are no jobs. There's no prospects for education, for the future. All of these things have been cut off for them. And they really were struggling. The people who I saw who were doing the best in the refugee camps were often the parents and the grandparents who had really young kids. Mm-hmm. And the reason was because they knew that they had to wake up every day and be strong for somebody else. And it was a lesson I would later take and apply to the work that I did with returning veterans. But one of the big lessons is that the most damaging thing, I think, for a man, for a human being, is to live without a sense of purpose. Purposelessness is the real issue. And that can manifest itself in all sorts of ways. It can manifest itself in addiction. It can manifest itself in self-loathing. It can manifest itself in despair. It can manifest itself in anger. But that's the real issue, is purposelessness. Mm-hmm. And when people have a purpose, then they can find a way through. And there's that great phrase that he who has the right why can make it through anyhow. And that was one of the big lessons for me in the refugee camp. So to your question, like, how did I get into that? I had that experience in China. Said, all right, I want to learn a lot more about the world and how this works and how I can be of service. And then after that work with the Bosnian refugees, I continued to do that the next summer with Rwandan refugees. And then, as you said, went on to work with street children in Bolivia, in one of Mother Teresa's homes for destitute and dying, et cetera, and continued to see all of these lessons about how people can live through real hardship.